Thanks so much for making the time to join us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion of strategic surprise and how to look at the world. Ours is a culture that believes in strategic surprise. Ours is also a political culture that doesn't like to be surprised. How occasionally in life we have experiences that throw into sharp relief something we hadn't necessarily thought about. I was just in the UK and talking with an historian who was working through the experience of the UK and trying to do projections of the world in the 1920s and 30s. They had a 10-year planning horizon and they thought they could predict. And of course they were taken by surprise by things that occurred within the 10-year time frame for which they had not prepared. We were made believers in strategic surprise by Pearl Harbor and reminded of that experience in 9/11. And in each case, our government has responded by reorganizing, refocusing, working harder, more diligently, creating teams in places like Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to do indicators and warnings in different areas, but yet the world still likes to keep us engaged and entertained with the multiple problems that it brings to us. Today, we're in a fortunate position to hear some early thinking that Andy Hoehn has been doing in the place where we find ourselves today, approximately 20 years into the war on terror, so to speak, but in a world that's rapidly changing and becoming even more complex than before. Andy Hoehn is the Vice President for Research and Analysis, Senior Vice President at the RAND Corporation. He has a broad writ in the organization to oversee all of the analytical work. We first collaborated, I think, 25, 30 years ago in our prior analytical roles, but then I very much admired the work that Andy undertook as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy. He's here today to present some preliminary thinking about a book project. The presentation itself will be recorded and thus on the record, but then when we move into the Q&A, that will be wide open. Please join me in thanking Dr. Andy Hoehn.
Thank you. Brad, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And as Brad said today, my intention is to run an experiment here, so I'm in the right place for experiments, I think. And it is to try out some ideas that several collaborators and I are working on and thinking in the direction of a book. We've been at this now for some months, a little over a year, in terms of thinking about where the world is and its heading, and importantly, what are the institutional responses that we need to be considering as we look at the world we're in versus the world that we had. And so I'll run through some details of that. I'm really grateful to Brad for organizing, and he, as he said, he and I have been collaborators. He did give away sort of the length of that time in which we've been doing this, but we've known each other a very long time. And a number of people in this organization I've come across in my career, and we're great admirers. And my colleague Susan Everingham from RAND is here as well. And more recently, we've been interacting more as institutions. And I think it's that kind of flavor of what I want to get at in this talk of how we think about an institutional response for the world we're in. So let me begin in a place where Brad really left us off in his introduction. And that was, we faced an emergency in September 11th of 2001. The country was under enormous attack. We hadn't had anything like that since the time of another emergency, and that was December 7th of 1941. Two enormous surprises, if you will. Looking back, maybe we can debate whether how much of a surprise or not. But both of those instances brought about sweeping reorganizations. I'll compare them a little bit, but I really want to focus on the one that was more recent, the one after 9/11. The sweeping reorganization that came after that in terms of consolidating functions with the goal of connecting the dots to make sure that we didn't confront as a nation another surprise like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. And we know, this audience knows, I'll remind you of a few, it was quite encompassing, but a sprawling new security apparatus, a new Department of Homeland Security, a new Director of National Intelligence, a reformulation or sort of a complete reorganization of the intelligence community, the establishment of the NCTC within the U.S. military, a great expansion of our special operations capability, a reorganization of the military more generally, the establishment of Northern Command. When I was in my role in the Pentagon, I was responsible for that. That was to create a command focused on security inside the United States, not just projecting military force beyond it. And this really intense, stepped-up focus on terrorism and intervention against Al-Qaeda and its collaborators wherever it spread or wherever it would occur. Primarily in the Middle East, but certainly beyond the Middle East. This took us to where the U.S. was now operating in places it had never been before, in Africa, operations in Central and Latin America against terrorists. It was all-encompassing in its focus. And it remarkably successful, I think we have to argue. We are now here 18 years later. We have not been subject to an attack like that. We've certainly had incidents, we've had scares, we've had threats. Most have been caught beforehand. We have had incidents like the Boston Marathon bombing in which people were killed. We did not know about those ahead of time, but we were able to close on them very quickly. But I think really remarkably successful, and I think we have to compare that to some of our close allies who haven't been so much. Major attacks in the UK since 9/11, France, Germany, Spain, India, Turkey, especially Iraq, Afghanistan. So the threat has continued in manifold ways across the globe, but not here in the United States. So I think we have to say on that count, a remarkably successful reorganization. But then but I think we also have to ask ourselves, at what cost? We certainly can measure the economic cost or the investment we've made. And I'm not here to argue that that was a bad investment. In fact, I think a remarkably good one. Indeed, the reforms that I'm talking about, I was in the government, Brad was in the government, and some of you were all part of these issues. And I think they were appropriate for the time. But I also know the decision makers I interacted with at that time, I think none of them believed that this would last for all time. That is to say, what we did in the aftermath of 9/11 would last forever. And I think we're at that moment now that we need to be asking the question of what does the world look like, as we move beyond what I'm calling a focus of zoom. That is, we went from a wide-angle view of the world that involved us in the Cold War to a zoom, that is a focus on terrorism, and terrorism primarily and security issues in the Middle East. And we're now moving back to a world of wide angle. So to state the obvious, I think, we can look at the situation in the Middle East, and we have been at war there for 30 years. Since we entered in a real way in the summer of 1990, this was in my first full year in the Pentagon, we entered the Middle East, and we have not left the Middle East since the summer of 1990. August 2nd, 1990 is when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And we have been there consistently since then. And we could even argue that was before that time. President Carter established the Carter Doctrine after the Soviet invasion of Iran. We had a presence in the Middle East beginning in about 1979. We'd built a military infrastructure in the Middle East over the decade that followed, from 79 to 89. That's what allowed us to carry out the very successful operations of the first Gulf War. But I think we do have to then ask ourselves, what have we accomplished in the Middle East? We have certainly kept energy supplies moving, and that was an important goal. But it isn't clear that the Middle East is any more stable today than it was when we entered, and in fact, we're now in a very threatening situation with Iran. as the current administration is ramping up pressure on Iran. And, I think we have to ask ourselves, after 30 years now in the Middle East, what do we have really to show for it? So I want to go backwards a little bit and look at this story some. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11. I came to work on September 12th of 2001. I met then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld on the steps of the Pentagon, and I was responsible at the time for finishing the then Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR that was underway. I was working on a report, and I can recall Rumsfeld telling me, we have a job to do now. Finish that up. We've got to get on with other things. That marked the beginning of the Zoom. I think that was appropriate for the time, and so in that sense, I think an appropriate measure, just as Roosevelt took measures like that after at the beginning of World War II. But having been on Zoom for that period of time and created now a warning machine whose focus was this, I think the role then had to become, what else were we going to do as we went over time? And we're now in a world in which I think we look at one of great power competition, one in which we're facing a set of non-traditional threats, one in which I need to pause for a second. I want to go back to the story of 9/11 and my interactions with then Secretary Rumsfeld. And it was clear then that we were on a very different path, a very focused path. But that wasn't what that administration came to do in its job. Its came to do was to focus with a very wide angle at the world, where it was going. You'll recall the language of that administration as it came to office. President Bush talked about skipping generation of weapons. We were going to prepare for a set of future challenges. To say that they were ready to say what that challenge was going to be, they weren't prepared, but they were thinking China. They were thinking of what Russia might become. They were thinking of new arrangements and relationships that would have to be built. I think they were thinking about new institutional responses that would need to be created. All of those things were in their minds as they realized they had an emergency, they had an imminent challenge, they had to focus and zoom quickly on something. And I think they did a remarkable job. I'm not here to criticize any of the decisions they made. We can talk about the Iraq War and the decision and so forth if you'd like, but I don't even want to criticize that. What I'd really like to say is, when all of the reforms that were put in place in the months that follow the 9/11 attack, is it time for us to now look at those in a different way and look at the world in a different way, look at the set of challenges that we're dealing with in a different way, and where that might lead us? That is to say, and as you look, if you have your focus on one set of things, and I'm here in a scientific community, if you're looking through one lens, you're going to see problems in a certain way. If you're looking through a different lens, you're going to see them in a different way. We've been on this Zoom, this very narrow focus for such a long time. And now we're trying to broaden that focus into what that might mean. Our language is, we went from wide-angle analog to Zoom. Zoom became, I would even say it was Zoom analog to begin with, and it became Zoom digital. We introduced a lot of new capabilities, new ways of thinking about problems and issues. But now we're, as a country, I think, realizing we have to go back to a wide-angle look at the world. And there are a lot of differences, and I really don't want to go into the politics right now, but I think this community is looking at a set of wide-angle challenges that as the world, and how we need to confront them in a very different way. So we're waking up to the world that emerged. I mentioned great power competition is one that's on our mind. China and Russia have both kept a panoramic focus while we were on Zoom. It took them into new areas, and it's causing us to think very differently about those relationships and our relationships with other partners with whom they're dealing. A host of emerging non-traditional threats have emerged. Everyone that I've talked to and my collaborators have talked to have said we're not prepared in certain areas, unprepared for issues like global pandemic, human, plant, and animal pandemic. Whether these are accidental or malicious, we've been traveled through central parts of the country. One of our hosts was the president of Kansas State University, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dick Myers, and looking at the biological research facility there. It's very clear that should something of large-scale animal or plant disease come to this country, we're not ready to deal with that. And they're convinced it's coming. It's coming, and there are people here that know things more about that than me. And you know, where the advances take us, how we think about that, what we do with that, I think a lot has to happen in terms of what we do to think about preparation for that. We're unprepared for the threat of controlled mass migration or uncontrolled mass migration. We witnessed it in the Middle East. We're seeing it now in Latin America. You know, it's 4 million people have left Venezuela. Another million are projected to leave. And they're moving into Colombia, a population there of about 50 million. So imagine 10% of a population moving into a country and what that means. And as we look at what climate change might bring over time, the expectations of very substantial numbers of people that are going to move from what were once inhabitable areas to that are becoming uninhabitable into surrounding areas that are inhabitable, what that migration is going to mean and how we're going to be ready for that. There's a host of issues associated with that. I think we're unprepared for novel applications of new technology. You know, a very small case here, but there are many that we could discuss, but a small case would be drones. Drones are a good example. Right now, we look at how that's being used for military applications. We know there are an enormous set of civil applications that are in mind, Amazon bringing, you know, diaper delivery and whatnot. But even in terms of, you know, how we look in the United States of where the authorities exist to deal with a threat that would come, you know, a drone threat. You know, I've been interacting with colleagues in the Department of Homeland Security. If there were to be a threat over a large, you know, structure, a stadium, or, you know, concert or whatnot, who has shoot-down authority? Even if we identified it, once identified, if it were over, and, you know, we don't know if it's hostile or not, if it's determined to be hostile, who's got the authority to interdict? It's a real problem. And so there are just a host, and, you know, the list could go on and on and on. And of course, more traditional military threats. Someone that Brad and I both knew, and I had a good fortune of seeing in his last months was Mr. Andy Marshall, the founder of Net Assessment in the Pentagon. A couple of months before he died, he and I had a very long conversation about his thoughts of as he was looking forward and the kind of problems. And of course, his view is that China really epitomized the kind of threats for which we're unprepared. He wasn't focused exclusively on China, but what it represented and where it was going. And you know, the conversation we had to do with the 30 years we've been in the Middle East and what's happened as others, you know, in a sense, while we were busy, what others were doing. And now as we bring our attention back to these issues, you know, how we think about them. And so he's hit, you know, among his concerns, or, you know, the idea of the notion of a mature precision strike regime that is, as information technologies and are brought to bear on applications of force, and, you know, and the ability to target, you know, precisely and use those applications in a wide array of situations, how we would think about that. And of course, we're waking up to that. We have understanding of how we might operate our own forces in the Far East, many people working on that. My colleagues at RAND, people at here are doing that as well. But we don't yet have answers to it. And I think what we're learning is we're moving from this notion of you know, Zoom, which had us focus on one set of problems, to now wide angle or panorama to a broad set of problems, that we're dealing, you know, in an era where we not only need to have sort of operational answers, but I think we're going to have new institutional answers, new kinds of collaboration as we think about that set of problems that we're dealing with. So where might this lead us? our thinking is we've been really looking at two pieces here. The first piece is what we're calling the warning machine itself, the intelligence apparatus. And we don't call it the intelligence community because I think in this era, as this is now the digital era, we know information is coming from so many different sources. This isn't just about an intelligence community dealing with classified information that's going to be the source of warning. Warning comes from many different areas. But how do we think about a warning machine that's on wide angle, that's looking at a broader range, a broad array of issues? We know, some things, some decisions were taken. There used to be, at the time that you and I worked together, Brad, there was a national intelligence officer for warning who had, that was a smallish office, about a dozen people, but it wasn't a dozen people that were responsible for warning. The dozen people were responsible for reaching out to all of the nodes in the intelligence community in various places to get a sense of what are the issues that are emerging, where are matters trending, is something different really taking place. That office was disestablished. The idea was that warning was everyone's responsibility. There are new ways in which warning is being thought of, new technologies brought to bear, how social media can play a role in warning. I have a friend who was a former director of IARPA, talked about how they were looking for little indicators of warning. These are not big trends as in, China's latest technology development, but small, near-term warning indicators, like sales of vinegar in areas. An indicator that protests are about to begin, because vinegar is what you apply to a handkerchief to offset the effects of tear gas. And so how do you find that out? You find that out from social media. And so they were using really interesting techniques. But how does that happen in a wider array? How do we apply this, new technologies to give us those kind of indicators? And importantly, what are the institutional mechanisms that we have to have in place? Do we need sort of a broader focus for wide angle, the counterpart to the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center? Do we need an apparatus like that that's collecting using both traditional sources of information and non-traditional sources to give us indications of where things are going? And what are the kind of collaborations that need to happen, across, not only within our own government, but across the globe, to make sure we've got eyes on the right problems that are emerging? So I could go on about warning, but that'll give you a flavor of some of the things that we're thinking about. The second, of course, is warning is one place, but action is another. And here I think even more work needs to be done in terms of what we're calling the action machine. The handoff from warning to action is a long-standing problem. When Brad mentioned strategic surprise, there are lots of reasons why those that warn aren't necessarily heard. Sometimes, by the way, some problems aren't warned, but often problems have been warned. They just haven't been heard. And the why of that is, there's a whole literature on it. The warning isn't persuasive. There may be a warner out there, but whatever is being warned, they don't persuade. Maybe the warning isn't welcome. It may not fit with a view of the world at a particular time. The warnee that they're receiving in might have other priorities. We could look at the rise of ISIS. I think as the Obama administration was dealing with another set of problems. Again, not to point fingers at President Obama, but there was a mindset. President Obama came to office, wanted to leave the Middle East. The idea that warning would be saying there's a problem that's going to keep you there for a longer time, maybe a very long time, that might not have been the welcome news. So the response was that this rise was characterized as the JV of the terrorism world. We knew later that was different. So the warning that may be unwelcome, or there may be other priorities. Again, the Obama administration example. Obama really was trying to move, and I think in the right ways, toward a different future, back to the wide-angle lens. I think looking back, where the decision was incorrect was the idea that you could leave one thing to go to the other. I think the decision would have been probably better if it was we can ramp down on one thing and focus on the other. It doesn't mean, but the idea that in this era not all problems end, and so how you take on a different focus. But the real issue I want to get at is how we have the communication from warning to action, and we have the right action mechanisms in place to deal with the kind of problems that we want to deal with. One is how action itself is interpreted. So the trend really since 9/11 has been to bring those decisions into the White House. It meant, the very large-scale growth of an NSC staff. That NSC staff is now shrinking under this administration, but there still is enormous power. Issues were there, decisions taken, you could bring and consolidate. But, and many of us that have worked in Washington know that White Houses are remarkable places, but they aren't places that are likely to be able to watch lots of things at any given time. It's why we built larger structures. And so if we think about an action machine for the future, my sense is we're probably less inclined to think that you want all decisions and operations being run out of the White House, be it the NSC staff or some other mechanism. What it might be, I think we don't know yet. I look at the Goldwater-Nichols reforms that took place in the Department of Defense in the waning days of the Cold War. There was a very interesting set of decisions where we had military services that at the time had responsibility for operations. Those were ended. What we did instead is there was a set of decisions that said combatant commanders, and then regional and specified. But the combatant commanders now, the regional commanders, are responsible for operations as the military services provide the wherewithal. We might be looking at a set of action mechanisms in the future in which we might be thinking about something similar, in which we could be thinking of collaborations among departments and agencies that would be akin to what the military services provide in terms of capabilities. And there may be action mechanisms that might be the parallel or a counterpart, say, to the combatant commanders. I don't know yet where all this is going to go. I think we're thinking. But I do think this is a moment when we need to be asking ourselves, if there is a focus on how we're going to be warned and look at the world in order to avoid surprise, what do we do when we identify issues, and how will those be handed off in terms of thinking about action? That's an area where, during our discussion today, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, because I think we're at a moment where, as we're moving in a clear recognition that it's time, maybe well past time, that we shift from this notion of zoom to wide angle, and thinking about wide angle now for a very different world, that we ought to be looking at what the institutional mechanisms and response mechanisms are to deal with the set of problems as we're going forward. So with that, I'm going to pause. We can go in a lot of different directions in terms of our discussion, but I wanted to just simply offer a framework. The idea that we had a world that was at wide angle. We went to a world, I think appropriately, that was zoomed to deal with a particular problem, but we're now in a position in which we now need to think differently about what are the array of problems we're dealing with in the world, and what are the mechanisms that we're going to have to contend with those. So Brad, I'm going to pause there and take any questions.